The story begins in a small, quiet town surrounded by hills and forests. A young woman, in her late 20s, lived a simple life with her mother. Her father had passed away when she was just a child, and she had few memories of him. All she knew was what her mother had told her, that he was a kind man who loved his family deeply. But there was always a sense of mystery surrounding his life, something her mother never fully explained. One rainy afternoon, while cleaning the attic, she stumbled upon an old, dusty box tucked away in a corner. The box was filled with random items, old photographs, a pocket watch, and a few handwritten letters. Among them was a sealed envelope with her name written on it in her father's handwriting. Her heart skipped a beat. She had never seen this letter before. Why had her father written to her? And why had it been hidden away all these years? With trembling hands, she opened the letter. The paper was yellowed with age, but the words were clear. Her father's handwriting was neat and steady, as if he had taken great care to write this message. The letter began with a simple greeting, but the words that followed were anything but ordinary. He wrote, "My dear daughter, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. There's something important I need to tell you, something I couldn't share while I was alive. This truth may change everything you know about our family, but I hope it will also set you free." The young woman's mind raced. What could her father possibly mean? She sat down on the attic floor, the letter in her hands, and continued reading. Her father explained that he had been keeping a secret for many years, a secret that involved her mother, their family, and a decision he had made long ago. He didn't go into detail in the letter, but he promised that the answers she was looking for could be found in a small village a few hours away. He had left instructions and a map, which he hoped would guide her to the truth. As she finished reading, she felt a mix of emotions, confusion, curiosity, and a strange sense of excitement. She had always felt like there was something missing in her life, something she couldn't quite put into words. Now, it seemed like her father was offering her a chance to uncover the truth. But she also felt a pang of guilt. Her mother had never mentioned any of this. Would she be upset if she found out about the letter? That evening, she decided to talk to her mother. She carefully brought up the topic, asking if there was anything about her father's past that she should know. Her mother's reaction was unexpected. She grew quiet, her face pale, and for a moment, it seemed like she was about to say something. But then she shook her head and simply said, "Your father was a good man. That's all you need to know." The young woman didn't push further, but she knew she couldn't let this go. The next morning, she packed a small bag and set off for the village her father had mentioned in the letter. The journey was long, and the roads were winding, but she felt a strange sense of purpose. She didn't know what she would find, but she was determined to uncover the truth. When she finally arrived at the village, it was unlike any place she had ever seen. It was small and peaceful, with cobblestone streets and old houses covered in ivy. She followed the map her father had left, which led her to a tiny cottage at the edge of the village. An elderly woman answered the door, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw the young woman standing there. "You look just like him," the woman said softly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I've been waiting for you." The young woman was stunned. Who was this woman, and how did she know her father? Before she could ask, the woman invited her inside. The cottage was cozy, with a fireplace and shelves filled with books. The woman introduced herself as a close friend of her father's and explained that she had been entrusted with a task, to share the truth about his past. As the young woman listened, she began to piece together the story. Her father had lived in this village many years ago, before he met her mother. He had been a different person then, with dreams and ambitions that were very different from the life he eventually led. But there was more to the story, something the elderly woman hesitated to reveal. "Your father made a choice," she said finally. "A choice that changed everything. But to understand why, you need to see this." She handed the young woman a small, worn-out journal. It was her father's, filled with his thoughts and memories from that time. As she flipped through the pages, she realized that this was just the beginning. The truth her father had spoken of was far more complicated than she had imagined, and it would take her on a journey that would change her life forever. The young woman sat in the cozy cottage, her father's journal resting heavily in her hands. The elderly woman, who had introduced herself as a close friend of her father's, quietly prepared a cup of tea and placed it on the table beside her. The room was filled with the scent of herbs and the faint crackling of the fireplace. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light through the windows. "Take your time," the elderly woman said gently. "What you're about to read will answer many of your questions, but it may also raise new ones. Your father wanted you to know the truth, but he also wanted you to be ready for it." The young woman nodded, her heart pounding as she opened the journal. The first few pages were filled with her father's thoughts about life in the village. He wrote about the beauty of the countryside, the simplicity of the people, and his dreams of becoming a writer. But as she turned the pages, the tone of the journal began to change. Her father's words grew heavier, more reflective, as if he were carrying a burden he couldn't share with anyone. She soon discovered why. In one entry, her father wrote about a woman he had fallen in love with, a woman who wasn't her mother. Her name was mentioned only once, but the way he described her made it clear that she had been someone very special to him. He wrote about their long walks through the hills, their shared dreams, and the deep connection they had. But then, something happened. The entries became vague, filled with regret and sorrow. "I had to make a choice," her father wrote in one particularly emotional passage. "A choice that would change everything. I couldn't stay with her, no matter how much I wanted to. There were things I couldn't explain, things I couldn't control. I had to leave, not just the village, but her. And it broke my heart." The young woman felt a lump in her throat as she read those words. She had always thought of her father as a simple, loving man, but now she was seeing a side of him she had never known. He had been someone with dreams, with passions, with a past that was far more complicated than she had ever imagined. As she continued reading, she learned that her father had left the village abruptly, without saying goodbye to the woman he loved. He had moved to the town where she and her mother now lived, started a new life, and tried to forget about the past. But it was clear from his journal that he had never truly moved on. He carried the weight of his decision with him every day, and it had shaped the person he became. The elderly woman, who had been quietly observing her, finally spoke. "Your father was a good man," she said. "But he was also a man who carried a lot of pain. He loved your mother, and he loved you, but there was always a part of him that remained here, in this village." The young woman looked up, her eyes filled with questions. Why did he leave? What was he running from? The elderly woman hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "It's not my place to tell you everything," she said. "But there's someone else you need to meet. Someone who can explain it better than I can." She stood up and gestured for the young woman to follow her. They left the cottage and walked through the village, the cobblestone streets quiet and peaceful in the evening light. The elderly woman led her to a small house at the edge of the village, surrounded by a garden filled with flowers. She knocked on the door, and after a moment, it opened. Standing in the doorway was a woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She looked at the young woman and froze, her expression a mix of surprise and emotion. "You look just like him," she whispered, her voice trembling. The young woman felt a shiver run down her spine. She didn't need to ask who this woman was. She could see it in her eyes, in the way she looked at her. This was the woman her father had written about in his journal, the woman he had loved and left behind. The elderly woman gently introduced them, then excused herself, leaving the two of them alone. The woman invited the young woman inside, and they sat down in a cozy living room filled with photographs and mementos. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was as if they were both trying to process the moment. Finally, the woman broke the silence. "I've often wondered if this day would come," she said softly. "Your father and I, we were very close. But life took us in different directions. He made a choice, and I respected it, even though it wasn't easy for either of us." The young woman nodded, her mind racing with questions. Why did he leave? What happened? The woman sighed, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "It's a long story," she said. "But the truth is, your father left because he thought it was the right thing to do. He believed he was protecting me, and protecting you. But it came at a cost." She reached for a photograph on the table and handed it to the young woman. It was a picture of her father, much younger, standing next to the woman. They looked happy, carefree, and deeply in love. The young woman felt a pang of sadness as she realized how different her father's life might have been if he had stayed. "There's more to the story," the woman said. "But it's not just about me, or your father. It's about you, too. Your father wanted you to know the truth because he believed it would help you understand who you are." The young woman felt a chill run through her. What did that mean? What was the truth her father had been trying to protect her from? She had come to the village looking for answers, but now she realized that the journey was far from over. There were still pieces of the puzzle missing, and she knew she wouldn't be able to rest until she found them. As the evening turned to night, the two women talked for hours, sharing stories and memories. The young woman learned more about her father's life in the village, about the dreams he had and the choices he made. But there was still one question that lingered in her mind, one that neither the elderly woman nor the woman in the photograph could answer. What was the secret her father had been trying to protect? And how would it change everything she thought she knew about her family? The young woman spent the night in the village, her mind swirling with everything she had learned. The woman her father had loved, let's call her Anna, had been kind and patient, answering her questions as best she could. But there were still gaps in the story, pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. Anna had hinted that there was more to the truth, something deeper and more complicated than she had revealed. The young woman knew she couldn't leave the village without uncovering the rest of the story. The next morning, Anna invited her to take a walk through the hills surrounding the village. The air was crisp, and the sun cast a golden glow over the landscape. As they walked, Anna began to open up more, sharing details about her life with the young woman's father. They had been young and in love, dreaming of a future together. But then, something had changed. "Your father was a man of principle," Anna said, her voice tinged with both admiration and sadness. "He believed in doing the right thing, even when it was hard. But sometimes, the right thing isn't always clear." The young woman listened intently, her heart aching for the pain her father and Anna had endured. "What happened?" she asked softly. "Why did he leave?" Anna paused, looking out over the hills as if gathering her thoughts. "There was an incident," she said finally. "Something that shook the village. Your father was involved, but it wasn't his fault. Still, he felt responsible. He believed that if he stayed, it would only bring more pain to the people he cared about." The young woman frowned, trying to make sense of what Anna was saying. "What kind of incident? What happened?" Anna hesitated, her expression conflicted. "It's not my place to tell you everything," she said. "But there's someone else you need to meet. Someone who was there when it happened. He can explain it better than I can." She led the young woman to a small farm on the outskirts of the village. An older man was working in the fields, his face weathered but kind. When he saw them approaching, he stopped and wiped his hands on his overalls. Anna introduced him as an old friend of her father's, someone who had known him well during his time in the village. The man nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at the young woman. "You have his eyes," he said quietly. "I always wondered if you'd come here one day." The young woman felt a lump in her throat. It was strange to hear people talk about her father in this way, to see how much he had meant to them. She had always thought of him as just her dad, but here, in this village, he was so much more. The man invited them to sit under a large oak tree, its branches providing shade from the morning sun. He began to tell the story of what had happened all those years ago. It started with a misunderstanding, a series of events that spiraled out of control. The young woman's father had been caught in the middle, trying to do what he thought was right. But his actions had unintended consequences, and the fallout had been devastating. He blamed himself, the man said, his voice heavy with regret. Even though it wasn't his fault, he couldn't forgive himself. He thought leaving was the only way to protect the people he loved. The young woman felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had always known her father as a kind and gentle man, but now she was seeing a side of him she had never known, a man burdened by guilt and regret. She couldn't imagine how hard it must have been for him to carry that weight all those years. But why didn't he ever tell me, she asked, her voice trembling. Why did he keep this a secret? The man sighed, his expression sympathetic. He wanted to protect you, he said. He thought that if you knew the truth, it would only bring you pain. But he also knew that one day, you might need to know. That's why he left you the letter. The young woman nodded, her mind racing. She had come to the village looking for answers, but now she realized that the truth was far more complicated than she had imagined. Her father's secret wasn't just about his past, it was about her, too. It was about the choices he had made and the legacy he had left behind. As the day wore on, the young woman spent more time with Anna and the old man, listening to their stories and piecing together the fragments of her father's life. She learned about the dreams he had, the mistakes he made, and the love he had for the people in his life. It was a side of him she had never known, and it made her see him in a whole new light. But there was still one question that lingered in her mind, one that no one seemed able to answer. What was the incident that had driven her father away? And how had it shaped the person he became? That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, the young woman sat alone by the fireplace in Anna's cottage, her father's journal open in her lap. She had read it cover to cover, but there was one entry that stood out to her, a passage where her father had written about a promise he had made, a promise he had kept even when it cost him everything. I made a choice, he had written. A choice that changed everything. But I did it because I believed it was the right thing to do. I only hope that one day, you'll understand. The young woman closed the journal, her heart heavy but also filled with a strange sense of peace. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she was beginning to understand. Her father had been a man of integrity, a man who had made difficult choices and lived with the consequences. And now, it was up to her to decide what to do with the truth he had left behind. As she drifted off to sleep that night, she knew that her journey wasn't over. There were still secrets to uncover, still pieces of the puzzle to find. But for the first time in her life, she felt a connection to her father that went beyond the memories she had. She felt his presence, his love, and his hope that she would find the truth, and that it would set her free. The next morning, the young woman woke up with a sense of determination. She had spent the night thinking about her father's journal and the stories she had heard from Anna and the old man. There was still so much she didn't understand, but she knew she couldn't leave the village without finding the missing pieces of the puzzle. She needed to know what had happened all those years ago, the incident that had driven her father away and shaped the course of his life. Anna was already up, preparing breakfast in the small kitchen. The smell of fresh bread and herbs filled the air, and the young woman felt a pang of gratitude for the kindness Anna had shown her. Over breakfast, she asked Anna if there was anyone else in the village who might know more about what had happened. Anna thought for a moment, then nodded. "There's one person," she said. "He was there that day, and he knew your father well. But he's a private man, and he doesn't like to talk about the past. Still, if anyone can tell you the full story, it's him." After breakfast, Anna led the young woman to a small, secluded cabin on the edge of the forest. The cabin was simple but well kept, with smoke rising from the chimney. Anna knocked on the door, and after a moment, it opened to reveal a man in his late 60s, with a weathered face and sharp, observant eyes. He looked at Anna, then at the young woman, and his expression softened. "I wondered when you'd come," he said quietly. Anna introduced him as someone who had been close to her father during his time in the village. The man invited them inside, and they sat down in a cozy living room filled with books and photographs. The young woman noticed a picture of her father on the wall, taken when he was much younger. He was smiling, his arm around the man who now sat across from her. The man began to tell the story, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He explained that the incident had started with a misunderstanding between two families in the village. There had been a dispute over land, and tensions had been high. The young woman's father had tried to mediate, to find a peaceful solution, but things had spiraled out of control. One night, a fire broke out on the disputed land, and though no one was hurt, the damage was significant. "Your father was blamed," the man said, his voice heavy with regret. Even though he had nothing to do with it, people thought he had taken sides. He tried to explain, but the rumors spread quickly. In the end, he felt he had no choice but to leave. The young woman listened in stunned silence. She had always thought of her father as a man who avoided conflict, someone who valued peace above all else. But now she was seeing a different side of him, a man who had been willing to stand up for what he believed in, even when it cost him everything. "Why didn't he fight back?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why didn't he stay and clear his name?" The man sighed, his expression pained. "He thought it was the only way to protect the people he loved," he said. "He believed that if he stayed, the conflict would only get worse. He didn't want anyone else to get hurt." The young woman felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had always known her father as a kind and gentle man, but now she was seeing the depth of his sacrifice. He had given up everything, his home, his dreams, even the woman he loved, because he believed it was the right thing to do. As the man continued to talk, he revealed more details about the incident and its aftermath. He explained how the village had eventually come to understand the truth, but by then, it was too late. Her father had already left, and no one knew where he had gone. It wasn't until years later that they learned he had started a new life in another town, with a new family. "He never forgot about us," the man said, his voice filled with emotion. "He would send letters sometimes, asking how everyone was doing. But he never came back. I think he felt he didn't deserve to." The young woman felt a lump in her throat. She had always thought of her father as someone who was strong and unshakable, but now she was seeing the vulnerability he had hidden from the world. He had carried the weight of his decision with him every day, and it had shaped the person he became. After leaving the cabin, the young woman and Anna walked back to the village in silence. The young woman's mind was racing, trying to process everything she had learned. She had come to the village looking for answers, but now she realized that the truth was far more complicated than she had imagined. Her father's secret wasn't just about his past, it was about the choices he had made and the sacrifices he had endured. That evening, as the sun set over the hills, the young woman sat alone by the fireplace in Anna's cottage, her father's journal open in her lap. She had read it cover to cover, but there was one entry that stood out to her, a passage where her father had written about the day he left the village. "I made a choice," he had written. "A choice that changed everything. But I did it because I believed it was the right thing to do. I only hope that one day, you'll understand." The young woman closed the journal, her heart heavy but also filled with a strange sense of peace. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she was beginning to understand. Her father had been a man of integrity, a man who had made difficult choices and lived with the consequences. And now, it was up to her to decide what to do with the truth he had left behind. As she drifted off to sleep that night, she knew that her journey wasn't over. There were still secrets to uncover, still pieces of the puzzle to find. But for the first time in her life, she felt a connection to her father that went beyond the memories she had. She felt his presence, his love, and his hope that she would find the truth, and that it would set her free. The young woman spent the next few days in the village, quietly processing everything she had learned. The letters, the photograph, and the stories from the people who had known her father painted a picture of a man who was deeply human, flawed, loving, and burdened by the weight of his past. She felt a profound connection to him, as if she had finally met the man behind the memories. But there was still one thing she needed to do before she could truly move forward. She decided to visit the place where it had all begun, the site of the fire that had changed her father's life. Anna offered to accompany her, and together they walked through the hills to a clearing on the edge of the forest. The land was overgrown now, with wildflowers and tall grass covering the scars of the past. But as the young woman stood there, she could almost feel the echoes of what had happened all those years ago. Anna pointed to a spot near the edge of the clearing. "That's where the fire started," she said softly. It was an accident, but at the time, no one wanted to believe that. People needed someone to blame, and your father, he was an easy target. The young woman nodded, her heart heavy. She could imagine the chaos and fear that must have gripped the village that night. She could also imagine her father, standing in the midst of it all, trying to do the right thing even as the world turned against him. As she stood there, she felt a sense of closure beginning to settle over her. She had spent so much of her life wondering about her father's past, and now she finally understood. He had been a man who had made mistakes, but he had also been a man who had tried to make amends. He had carried the weight of his choices with him every day, and in the end, he had done what he believed was best for the people he loved. That evening, as the sun set over the hills, the young woman sat by the fireplace in Anna's cottage, her father's journal open in her lap. She had read it countless times, but now the words felt different. They were no longer just the words of a man she had barely known, they were the words of her father, a man who had loved her deeply and had wanted to protect her, even from the truth. She closed the journal and looked at the small, carved wooden figurine she had found in the box. It was a simple but beautiful piece, shaped like a bird in flight. She wondered if her father had made it, and what it had meant to him. She held it in her hand, feeling a sense of connection to him that went beyond words. The next morning, she packed her things and prepared to leave the village. Anna walked her to the edge of town, her eyes filled with both sadness and pride. "You've done something brave," Anna said. "Not many people would have the courage to face the truth the way you have." The young woman smiled, though her heart was heavy. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "I needed to know who my father was. And now, I think I do." Anna hugged her tightly, and for a moment, they stood there in silence, two women connected by the memory of a man they had both loved in different ways. As the young woman drove away from the village, she felt a strange mix of emotions, sadness for the pain her father had endured, gratitude for the love he had shown her, and a sense of peace that she had finally found the truth. She knew that her journey wasn't over, that there would still be moments when she would miss him and wonder what might have been. But she also knew that she had found something precious, a deeper understanding of who he was and why he had made the choices he had. When she returned home, she sat down at her desk and took out a blank piece of paper. She began to write a letter, not to her father, but to herself. She wrote about everything she had learned, about the love and sacrifice that had shaped her father's life, and about the truth that had changed everything. She wrote about the village, the people who had known him, and the stories they had shared. And she wrote about the bird figurine, which she now kept on her desk as a reminder of the man who had loved her so deeply. When she finished the letter, she folded it carefully and placed it in an envelope. She didn't need to send it to anyone, it was enough to know that the words were there, a testament to the journey she had taken and the truth she had found. As she sat there, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had come to the village looking for answers, and she had found them. But more than that, she had found a connection to her father that went beyond the memories she had. She had found his love, his pain, and his hope that she would understand. And now, as she looked at the bird figurine on her desk, she knew that she did. Her father's secret had changed everything, but it had also given her something precious, a deeper understanding of who he was, and who she was because of him. The truth had set her free. And for the first time in her life, she felt ready to move forward, carrying her father's love with her every step of the way.